Most people who watched North Korean soldiers march through Red Square on Saturday saw a military parade. What they actually watched was a transfer of power, and that transfer is the official end of an order you and I have lived inside for our entire adult lives. For 81 years, Moscow has held this parade. For 35 of those years, the post-Cold War arrangement has held the world roughly in place. And in roughly 4 minutes of footage, men carrying silver rifles, a flag that the United Nations Security Council has formally sanctioned, a banner reading Victory Day. Both of those eras quietly moved into the past tense. The headline says North Korea marched in Moscow for the first time. That headline is correct. It is also nearly useless. Because what marched in Moscow was not really North Korea. What marched in Moscow was an announcement. A 4-decade rulebook governing which countries may be touched and which may not, which alliances may form and which may not, which flags may stand beside which flags. That rulebook is no longer being enforced. This was not a parade, it was a ceremony. A small, deliberate, perfectly choreographed ceremony in which one global order surrendered to another, in front of a watching world that was told to look at the rifles and not the rifles' meaning. If you understood that the moment you saw it, you understood something almost nobody is willing to say plainly. What we are going to do is take that 4 minutes of footage and pull from it 3 signals. 3 specific things the marching was designed to communicate, only one of which the headlines have correctly identified. The framework matters, because parades are language. Authoritarian regimes do not perform parades for emotion. They perform parades to send messages to other governments, and the cost of a misread message, historically, is measured in territory and lives. The anchor number you need to hold in your head is this: 15,000. That is how many North Korean combat troops Pyongyang has deployed to support Russia since the two governments signed the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership in Pyongyang on June 19, 2024. Figures reported by the South Korean National Intelligence Service. That number is larger than the entire active military of NATO members like Luxembourg, Iceland, and Slovenia combined. And the soldiers who marched on Saturday were drawn directly from that pool. By the end of the next 20 minutes, you will read every future Red Square parade with a precision that 99% of the people watching news will never reach. To understand what happened on Saturday, you have to go back not to the war in Ukraine, but to 1961. In July of that year, a Soviet leader named Nikita Khrushchev signed a mutual defense treaty with Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandfather. The treaty contained one clause that mattered above all others. If either country was attacked, the other would intervene. It was, in plain language, the same arrangement that bound NATO members to one another in Article 5. 2 eventually nuclear powers pledged to defend a small, mountainous, paranoid state on the Korean peninsula. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that clause died with it. Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, formally let the treaty lapse. From 1991 onward, North Korea had no great power protector. That is the structural reason it spent 33 years building nuclear weapons. A small state without a patron and without geographic depth has exactly one way to make itself untouchable, and Pyongyang chose it. Then, on June 19, 2024, Vladimir Putin flew to Pyongyang. He signed a new treaty on comprehensive strategic partnership. Article 4 of that treaty contains language strikingly similar to the 1961 clause, that if one party comes under armed attack, the other shall provide assistance without delay using all available means. Putin himself, standing beside Kim Jong-un, described the agreement as a breakthrough document. That is not how breakthrough documents normally get described by Russian heads of state. That language was chosen deliberately, and the troops who marched on Saturday were the public ratification of every word inside it. Which brings us to the part of this story that almost nobody in the Western press has connected. Now here is where this stops being a story about North Korea and starts being a story about you. Because the troops that marched in Red Square on Saturday were not the most valuable thing Pyongyang sent to Russia. Something else was exchanged in this deal. Something that does not appear in any parade, something most of the experts have not even named yet. And that exchange is going to reshape 3 continents while almost nobody is watching. When most analysts write about the Russia-North Korea relationship, they describe it the way a sportscaster describes a trade. Russia gets troops and artillery shells. North Korea gets oil, food, hard currency. The numbers feel rough but reasonable. 2 struggling states helping each other survive. That is the wrong frame. The right frame is this: Russia is paying North Korea. But the most important thing Pyongyang is receiving is not on the official ledger. It is combat experience. For the first time since the Korean War ended in 1953, the North Korean military has battle-tested infantry. Soldiers who have operated under modern drone surveillance. Soldiers who have learned electronic warfare in real conditions. Soldiers who have absorbed the lessons of the most documented conventional war in human history. That is an asset money cannot buy. And Pyongyang now has it. Here is the ledger nobody is showing you. In exchange for those 15,000 troops and an estimated several million artillery shells, figures cited by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency in reports from 2024 and 2025, North Korea has received, according to South Korean intelligence assessments, a salary of roughly $2,000 per soldier flowing back to Pyongyang, an estimated 600 to 700 tons of rice per year, oil deliveries that quietly bypass United Nations sanctions, and what intelligence services believe is the transfer of certain space and satellite technologies. That is the visible ledger. The invisible ledger is the one that matters more, because what Pyongyang has actually purchased, using its young men as currency, is something far larger than groceries. It has purchased entry into a club. The club of states that great powers protect. The club it has wanted to join since 1991. This is where your wallet enters the story. Roughly 70% of the world's most sophisticated semiconductors are designed in, manufactured on, or pass over the Korean peninsula. The peninsula is one of the most concentrated zones of economic value on the planet. If the security calculus shifts even slightly, if Seoul begins seriously debating its own nuclear program, if Japan accelerates rearmament, if American forces in the region thin out, every supply chain that runs through that geography prices in new risk. Memory chips, automotive controllers, the entire smartphone industry, the electric vehicle revolution. And that risk does not stay in Asia. It arrives in your grocery bill, your phone, the car you cannot afford to replace, the appliances that have quietly doubled in price over the last 4 years. There is a second mechanism most people miss entirely. The ammunition Pyongyang has shipped to Russia is not Russia's only source of artillery shells, but it is a meaningful percentage of the total. Some assessments put it as high as 50% of the shells fired in certain phases of the Ukrainian conflict. Figures attributed to Ukrainian and Western intelligence services in 2024 and 2025. That dependency creates something obvious but rarely spoken aloud. Russia is now functionally dependent on North Korean industrial output to continue the war. When a great power becomes dependent on a small one, the small one has acquired leverage, and Pyongyang has it, which means every concession Moscow makes to keep that supply flowing, every piece of missile guidance technology, every submarine schematic, every satellite handshake, is a permanent transfer of capability from a former superpower to a state of 26 million people, a state that already has nuclear weapons, a state whose ballistic missile arc, according to public statements from U.S. Northern Command, now reaches the continental United States. The K-shape of this transfer is the part that should give serious people pause. Europe absorbs the ammunition. America absorbs the missile threat. South Korea and Japan absorb the regional shift. Each region gets a different bill. And the country writing the bills is the country that 4 years ago we still called a hermit kingdom. That is the architecture that marched in Red Square on Saturday. The men with silver rifles were the wrapping paper. The architecture was the gift. But the architecture is not the worst of it. The worst of it is what those troops mean for two countries you have probably not connected to this story at all. Take a deep breath before this next part, because what just connected in Red Square is not a two-nation deal. It is the visible thread of a four-country lattice, and one of those four countries sits in your headlines every single week, and almost nobody is naming it in the same sentence as North Korea. The four countries are Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. Each contributes something the other three cannot manufacture. Each receives something the other three cannot supply. None of them have signed a formal alliance. All of them are now coordinated enough that strategic planners in Washington, in Brussels, in Tokyo, and in Seoul have begun describing them as a single operational system. This is not opinion. The phrase used in the 2025 Annual Threat Assessment published by the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence is an increasingly coordinated alignment of state actors hostile to United States interests. That is the careful, lawyered intelligence community way of saying, the lattice exists. Look at the contributions. Russia provides the nuclear umbrella, the energy reserves, and the United Nations Security Council veto. Without Russia, none of the other three could sustain confrontation with the United States for very long. With Russia, all of them can. Iran provides drones, the Shahed series, which transformed the Ukrainian theater starting in late 2022, and the discount oil that lubricates the Chinese economy when sanctions are tightened. Iran also provides geographic depth. Any conflict that touches the Strait of Hormuz puts roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil at risk overnight. China provides the economic backbone, the dual-use goods, the financial channels that survive Western sanctions, the manufacturing capacity. China rarely speaks publicly about the lattice. China rarely needs to. Its silence is the floor that holds the other three up, and North Korea provides what none of the others can: Battle-tested infantry willing to die in someone else's war, ammunition production at industrial scale, and the demonstration effect. The demonstration effect is the part that matters most, because what North Korea showed on Saturday is that a small, sanctioned, isolated state can survive and thrive by chaining itself to a great power. Every other small state currently calculating its position is watching that demonstration. Before we keep going, something deserves a full stop. We are talking about a war that, according to the most recent United Nations monitoring reports, has produced more than 12,000 documented civilian deaths in Ukraine and military casualties on both sides that credible analysts now estimate run into the hundreds of thousands. Those are real people. Those are not numbers on a chart. Behind every figure on the ledger I just described is a household that has been broken. Ukrainian, Russian, North Korean, and a child who will grow up without a parent. The strategic analysis matters precisely because those costs are continuing to accumulate, not because they are anything less than tragedies. Now, the historical parallel. Every student of 20th century history knows the signature pattern. Powers that feel encircled begin signing bilateral treaties of necessity. Each treaty looks small in isolation. Each adds one new line to a map. And then one day, in the space of about 6 weeks, the lines on the map all activate at once, and a regional conflict becomes a global one. The Russo-North Korean Treaty was signed in June 2024. The Iran-Russia Strategic Partnership was upgraded in 2025. The China-Russia No Limits Partnership was declared in February 2022. 3 bilateral lines. One pattern. The pattern is old, and it has played out before. I am not saying we are in 1914. I am saying we are closer to 1914 than the people writing comfortable analysis from comfortable cities want to admit. The probability that this lattice produces a major military escalation involving more than 2 states in the next 36 months, estimates from credible strategic think tanks now place that figure in the 25 to 35% range. It is not 50%, it is not certain, but it is no longer a number you can dismiss with a shrug. And here is the gap narrative nobody wants to face plainly. The official position of 3 of the 4 lattice members is that no formal alliance exists. The observable reality is that they coordinate weapons transfers. The observable reality is that they coordinate diplomatic positioning at the United Nations. The observable reality is that one member's troops march in another member's capital while a third member's drones fly in the same theater of war. The gap between the official denial and the observable reality is not a communications problem. It is the structural signature of an alliance that does not yet wish to be named. The reason it does not yet wish to be named is that the moment it is formalized, the response from the other side becomes harder to contain. So it remains informal. And informal is exactly the form alliances take in the years immediately preceding the moment they stop being informal. That is the architecture that marched in Red Square on Saturday. And that architecture is now visible to anyone willing to look at it without flinching. Step back from the troops, the treaties, the missiles, the rifles for a moment. Because what all of this, every march, every signature, every shell, actually means for someone watching this from an ordinary kitchen table somewhere far from Red Square comes down to one specific thing. Someone has to say it out loud. Now you know. What I want you to take from this is not fear. Fear is not useful. Panic is not useful. What is useful is the map. Because when you understand the system, when you can see the shape of the lattice and the logic of the trade, you can see what is coming before it happens. And that is the most valuable thing any of us can have in a world that is reordering itself this quickly. Now, I want to give the counter-argument a fair hearing, because serious people with serious credentials look at everything I have just described and arrive somewhere much calmer. The skeptical view goes like this. The Russia-North Korea-Iran-China alignment is not an alliance. It is a coalition of necessity, held together by shared opposition to a single power rather than shared interests of their own. Russia and China have a long history of mistrust along their shared border. Iran and Russia compete in oil markets. China is not going to spend trillions of dollars in trade with the West for the sake of Pyongyang. The lattice is brittle, internally contradictory, and likely to fracture the moment any one member faces a real cost. That view contains real truth. Authoritarian alliances historically do fracture under pressure. Stalin and Hitler signed a treaty in August 1939, and 22 months later, they were at war with each other. The marriage of convenience between Mao and Stalin lasted barely a decade before turning to border clashes. Small states like North Korea have a long habit of being used and then discarded. The honest picture, stripped of both the panic and the complacency, is this. The lattice is real. It is also unstable. Both of those things are true at the same time. The danger is not that it endures. The danger is the specific shape its eventual fracture takes. Because fragile alliances of necessity have, historically, broken in the most violent ways possible. So what do you watch? Watch 3 specific things. Watch what Beijing says, and does not say, in the months following Saturday's parade. The Chinese reaction is the single most important data point in this entire story because China is the floor underneath the lattice. If Beijing distances itself publicly, the lattice loses gravity. If Beijing endorses, the lattice gains a permanence it has not had before. Watch what Seoul does about nuclear weapons. South Korean public opinion has shifted dramatically over the past 3 years on the question of an indigenous nuclear program. If Seoul moves toward acquiring its own deterrent, the entire East Asian security architecture changes in a single quarter. Watch the price of oil. The lattice's most fragile member is Iran. The lattice's most expensive moving part is its energy economics. If oil moves sharply in either direction over the next 6 months, you will know who is winning the internal argument inside the lattice and who is losing it. Those 3 signals will tell you which direction this resolves before any official statement is made about it. There is one more thing worth saying. The men who marched in Red Square on Saturday were soldiers. They did not write the treaty. They did not arrange the ceremony. They marched because they were ordered to march. Behind every one of those silver rifles is a human being whose life will be shaped by decisions made in rooms they will never enter. That is true of soldiers on every side of every conflict. And it is part of the reason strategic analysis exists in the first place, to help the rest of us recognize the patterns early enough that fewer people end up in those formations. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme, and the rhyme this time is unmistakable to anyone willing to listen for it. The people who see the lattice clearly today will be the people who navigate what comes next. Everyone else will be told what happened only after it has already happened to them. Someone has to say it out loud. Now you know,